sort of like a denial of service attack nowadays. Some boxes were hacked into, and squatters would take up residence and do their own things. They'd get kicked out and they'd set up somewhere else. Some boxes were political soapboxes, some were journals, some were there to pass on strange religious messages, and occasionally, someone would actually leave you a message if you were out. At its peak, there were no less than 50 boxes, or probably more than that, and in that scene, and then there were countless hundreds of other people who would call them up for entertainment, but not own boxes themselves. The two guys who I actually started the National Cynical Network with, Alexander T. Newport and Ronald Redball, were very much in that voicemail box world almost from the beginning. So bringing us up to 1999, I was at KFJC, which is a college radio station in Los Altos Hills, California. Started to create a show there called Midnight Voice Jail, utilizing the many hours of voicemail messages and weirdness that Ronald and Al and various friends of Ronald and Al had accumulated over the years, weaving those messages into what I call a psychedelic documentary called Midnight Voice Jail. So we did about 50 episodes in all, 50 half-hour to 1-hour episodes. So if you're interested in hearing or getting this series, the place to go is nationalcynical.com. That's www.nationalcynical, all one word, nationalcynical.com. Take the webcasts link at nationalcynical.com, and there will be a link there where you can hear, just scroll down, you'll hear the best of edits of the show. And there's also links on that page through which you can find the Voice Jail FAQ, and you can also find a link there through which you can buy and download the entire series. So again, you'll want to go to nationalcynical.com, and from there it's the webcasts link to hear and find out more about this project. Oh, and I also wanted to mention I will be on Over the Edge on KPFA the last night of the month at midnight, which I believe is Thursday night. 5-hour show, largely centering around Voice Jail on KPFA 94.1, or go to kpfa.org to tune into that. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
So that was Phineas Narco of the National Cynical Network talking about Voice Jail and a social networking community that essentially grew around voicemail boxes. Now I want to move over to a group of people that had a very long tradition and actually defined the term culture jamming. So with that, I would like to introduce Mark Hosler of Negative Land.
Hey, I get to be at the podium. Great. Yeah, I'm a founding member of the group Negative Land. It sounds like some of you have heard of us. That's great. We've been around for now almost 30 years, which is hard to believe. Cutting up sound, appropriating and rearranging things, a lot of it taken from corporately owned mass media. We were doing this back in the days when we used reel-to-reel tape and razor blades, tape loops, stuff like that. Didn't start out being concerned about issues around copyright law, weren't thinking of what we were doing. I was in high school when it started and certainly didn't think of it as these kinds of cultural civil disobedience, cultural interventions. But over the years of doing the kind of work we did of appropriating media, we increasingly realized that this form of collage and cut up and appropriation was a really great way to talk about systems of power and information, communication, and pop culture, and do it in a way that oftentimes is really quite funny, too. We also always loved just listening in on things, and we were always recording shortwave radio broadcasts, you know, back when you could tune into people's phone calls in the early days of cell phones, stuff like, you know, when the carrier frequencies it was on were things you could pick up with a scanner at home. We'd record that. And we were always picking up things from ham radio jammers. And because they like to just kind of jam each other out with test tones. Any of you here ham folks? All right. Hammer jammers. On our weekly radio show, which was just mentioned in Phineas Narco's talk, Over the Edge, we've been doing kind of thematic shows since 1981. It's still on to this day. And we did a series of shows that were all about jammers and ham radio jammers, and we were using some of these recordings. And one of the characters we've evolved on the show is a guy named Crosley Bendix, and he did a review of jamming, but took the idea of jamming, which in the ham world is pretty much just silly, dumbass, you know, swearing at people and just using test tones. It's pretty silly, but fun stuff. And he took it, and in the guise of his character, he talked about it from more of a cultural standpoint, and was talking about what he called it culture jamming, and like people altering billboards, things like that. And so that's how the phrase kind of popped up. This is back in 1984. I think in 89 or 90, a writer named Mark Deary, who's actually lives in upstate New York, was writing a sort of a trend piece for Elle magazine, talking about different people and artists who were doing kind of a creative activist work by using the media to talk about the media, kind of creating this sort of hall of mirrors thing. And he ended up latching onto our term, culture jamming, and used it in this article. He then was asked by, what is it, the Open Media series? He wrote a pamphlet about it, and then it came to the attention of Adbusters magazine. And Adbusters magazine had been looking for a term, a phrase of some time to kind of label what they were doing. They wanted to brand the movement of attacking the branding of everything, which I think is actually a very short-sighted approach. But they took the phrase and really ran with it and started talking about it in their magazine and came up with culture jamming how-to videos and calendars and probably coffee mugs. So it took on a life of its own that spread far beyond Negativland's initial creation of it. I think at this point, though, does anyone reading Adbusters these days? Are they even mentioning the phrase culture jamming anymore? I feel like they've sort of finally dropped it. Did they drop it? It's still in there? Okay. They didn't invent Buy Nothing Day either, but you'd never know it from reading the magazine. But it's interesting. It's interesting what they've done with it, and there's not enough time here to really talk about it, but obviously I think we're all essentially on the same side. But there's some curious qualities about how they've kind of taken and run with other people's ideas and used them in ways that I think ultimately, I think it's really incredible to take media, to realize that you can take media and repurpose it and reuse it, and at this point it's becoming so normal of an approach that just a 13-year-old kid, you know, with their parents' iMac is putting stuff up on YouTube that is using all of these techniques that just a few years ago were seen as being these completely avant-garde approaches to making art and media. This stuff is becoming incredibly mainstream right now, you know, to the point where it's made its way into academia and college courses and stuff like that. So anyway, that's a little brief overview of how the phrase ended up coming into use. How was that? Okay. So let me just really, well, I have two little short video clips. I think it's going to put me a little bit over my 10-minute limit here, but I was told that was okay. So as I said, the more Negativland started appropriating media, the more we thought about what it meant to do this. What can you do by taking stuff that doesn't belong to you? And Richard Lyons, a member of Negativland, he was in a thrift store. He found a record that's called If Footmen Tire You, What Will Horses Do? And it had the Reverend Estes W. Perkle from Louisiana. He was talking about the communists taking over the United States sometime by the early 70s.